Okay, so in these last three chapters, we're going to be talking about fiscal and monetary policy. And you'll have to forgive me making these three chapters at home so you can see my tablecloth. I didn't choose it. And I'm also simultaneously watching my son, so I'm sure he will interrupt. And if you listen very closely, you can hear Daniel Tiger's neighborhood in the background. Try to ignore it. Just tolerate me. I think these explanations I'm providing, I hope, are useful. So I want to make it a priority, despite these little differences and probably distractions. Just forgive me. Just work with me on this. I think I'll get through this. So the point of these three chapters is that we're talking about monetary policy. And before we get to that, we're going to talk about fiscal policy. And the idea is that the government and the central bank in an economy, so when we're talking about fiscal policy, we're talking about the government. When we're talking about monetary policy, we're talking about the central bank. That these two agencies influence the market and the economy as a whole. Why would they do that? Because if you remember way far back, we talked about business cycles and how economies have peaks and troughs. Well, the idea is that within this, that if you're at a low point, you could do things to help the economy. If you're at a high point, you'd say, wow, we really need to cool the economy down. So what we would see is that we could do two types of things here. We could do things that are expansionary, which is what you would do when you're at a trough, because that would help grow the economy. And you could do things to cool down the economy, and that would be called a contractionary policy. So here's what we're going to talk about over these next three chapters. Is we're going to talk about there being a type of fiscal policy and monetary policy, and whether that fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary, or whether that monetary policy is expansionary or contractionary. And you can use both types of policies when you're at a peak. You can use both types of policies when you're in a trough. You can decide that one is not as useful as the other. These are all things we'll talk about over these next three chapters. Okay, so with that overview, let's now talk about the chapters here. So, of the three chapters, there's only one on fiscal policy, so let's start talking about that. When we talk about fiscal, we're talking about the government. And we're talking about the government spending money and collecting taxes. Okay, so that influences the economy. So we're going to have to talk about that kind of policy, and in the case of the U.S. especially, how that contributes to debt existing. Okay. Probably for most of you, what most of you like to are probably more concerned about is this idea that the federal government right now is running a significant debt. A pretty significant debt that, my memory serves me right, is about $19 trillion. So debt would be all of the accumulated deficits. Deficits are accumulated on a yearly basis. So you could imagine that basically every year we might fall a little bit short. That would mean that we're spending more than we're taxing, right? Because when the government collects taxes, that's its revenue. And if the revenue that the government is collecting is less than how much it's spending, well, then it's going to have a deficit. Over time, those deficits add up to the debt. And the problem with the U.S. is that it's got a lot of debt. So much so that basically it's the federal... okay, 1 second here. Okay, Truman. Okay. There you go. Okay, sorry about that. He's 3, so he's learning to use the bathroom. The credit rating is like a credit score. So basically, this first point here, this first bullet point, was that basically the government had collected so much debt that its credit score went down. Now, the reason why this happened in 2011 was because there was a lot of expansionary fiscal policy in 2008-2009. So that obviously contributed to the debt. And so we're going to have to look at some of these things here. Now you're going to see words like aggregate supply, aggregate demand. We skipped a chapter where that would have been explained more fully, so I'm going to have to do some background explanations. Truman, don't sing. Okay. I don't know. Who do you want to blame? I don't think it really matters too much. I don't know. Not that I hate all politics, but if you look at this, the first Bush was running a budget deficit. The Clinton years, at the very tail end of the Clinton years and the very beginning of the Bush, the second years, there was a bit of a surplus. And then, Truman, can you stop that? And then there's a bit more of a deficit in these years, and especially in the Obama administration. Why does it, I mean, how do I say this as balanced as possible? Well, I don't need to be balanced. I'm just talking to you about the data here. It increases this much, not necessarily because of Obama's policies, although it may be, but not necessarily as much that as it is the fact that the government was in the economy was in a deep recession here. And because it was in a deep recession, the government collected less in taxes and spent more money. The only critical comment I can make is that in these years right here, this was a very strong economy. So you wouldn't expect there to be such large deficits when the economy is performing that well. That's about the only thing I can say. Now, you could say, if you want to defend Bush, you could say that terrorism, you could say it was a different kind of economy, that one that didn't grow as quickly. So there's lots of other arguments that maybe this isn't a true estimate. But on the other hand, it did go up this much, largely because of the tax cuts that were imposed in 2001. And those are tax cuts that economists have generally said were probably a bad idea, generally. Again, I'm not trying to be political, it's just telling you what economists have generally thought of it to be. Okay, so when we talk about the government spending money, the government spends money in one of two categories. Spending by the government can either be discretionary or mandatory. Let's start with discretionary. So discretionary is, right, you can see those things of like how a bill becomes a law, things like that. That the government, has to make decisions about how much it's going to spend by taking the bill to Congress, and right, that funds things like transportation, education, welfare benefits, some welfare benefits, the environment, funding for research. All these things you have to decide how much you're going to spend on a yearly basis or every 2 years. We spend a lot of time as a society debating this discretionary spending. The other category is mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that has to happen. It's required. That's the mandatory part of it. To change mandatory spending, Congress would have to change the law. So this doesn't go through the normal budget process. Basically, let's take a program like Social Security, which is one of the examples here. Social Security, as it's written, says, right, if you meet certain criteria, you get to collect Social Security payments. That Congress has to fund that, right? You can't just say, no, we're going to cut spending so that people who deserve the benefits, are entitled to the benefits, don't get them. So, we talk a little bit about this, but the problem is that as a society, we spend much more of our time talking about discretionary spending, right? I mean, think about as we talk about like politics and we talk about how Republicans differ from Democrats, they talk exactly about how they're going to do these things differently. Yeah, if I want to look at how much is spent, let's just see here. Let's see how quickly I can find this for you. Okay, so that would be something like this. So this is going to be a really messy looking clock. Yeah, we're about $19 trillion in debt. The deficit itself is about $500 billion. But here's the thing. This is the reason why I pulled this very messy looking site up. Is that most of the largest budget items, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, income security, net interest on debt, federal pensions, that's all mandatory spending. Meaning that most of the biggest parts of the U.S. budget is something that we as a society don't talk as much about. Okay, so let's go back to this. When we talk about discretionary policy, then, the part that it is of the federal budget, which is about maybe about 40%, maybe as high as 40%. This is adjusting, and it's adjusting to move the economy to a certain point. So as I said here, if we plot this out and we have a business cycle, then if I was at my peak, I'd probably want to use some contractionary fiscal policy. And if I was at a trough, I'm just going to put it way over here just for spacing issues, I would probably want to use some expansionary policy. And that's exactly how I'm going to pull this off with discretionary policy. So I'll do certain things that either increase taxes or reduce government spending when the economy is doing very well. What does expansionary fiscal policy look like? It looks like I'm either then reducing taxes or I'm increasing spending. Okay, so the one we had talked about before would have been in the Bush administration, for instance, cutting taxes. In the Reagan administration, especially, cutting of taxes. Even the Kennedy administration used this as they cut the tax rate from a high that was in the what was it, like the 90th percentile, down quite a bit. If you cut taxes, the idea is that people then spend their tax savings more, and that helps stimulate the economy. Don't worry about these references to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The idea here, well, do I want to? No, I don't need to talk about it. Let's try to ignore it for right now. Don't worry about this. I'm not testing you on this because we did not cover these two chapters here, or this chapter that talked about these two topics. So we reduce taxes to stimulate the economy because we think that people will spend the money themselves more. Again, you can kind of ignore this second part to this, but then the idea is that not only when the government spends money does that help stimulate the economy, but it's also the case that it multiplies upon itself, meaning like, let's take for instance, let's say the state builds a new highway. West Oahu, as you know, is right next to a planned rail station. And I don't know how many of you ever go to that 7-Eleven on Farrington that's by campus, but that place is really, really, really crowded in the morning. And it's crowded with construction workers that are working on the rail project and other construction, public projects around the area. It's a perfect example of the multiplier effect, because not only is the construction worker benefiting from that public project of building rail, but so is the 7-Eleven owner, right? And so are people that own apartments that they're renting out to the construction workers. So does Costco, because then those people go out and buy more groceries or buy more food or buy more gasoline. All of that happens because the government spends some money and then people do more and more based on having received that money. Okay, so looks like I cannot ignore it any longer here. Let me do as much as you're going to be responsible for. Let me try to explain what this graph looks like. Okay. So imagine if we were to look at the entire economy as a whole. This would represent the overall price level in the economy. This would reflect the overall output levels in the economy. And what we say is, okay, what would all the demand of all the people in the economy look like, of all the sectors in the economy? It would be downward sloping like this, and we would call it aggregate demand. And that in the short run, the aggregate supply curve will be upward sloping. Now it's upward sloping, but curved. In the long run, it's going to look different though, because in the short run, what economists assume is that not all prices adjust quickly. In the long run though, all prices do adjust, meaning that in the long run, that the aggregate supply curve is completely vertical, and it's fixed at a level of GDP that reflects where the economy would be on its production possibilities frontier, meaning it represents the economy performing at its fullest potential. So let's kind of presume that this I had drawn this where it was going right through the center here. So this would be an economy that's in a long run equilibrium, because its short run supply curve and aggregate demand curve intersect at exactly the long run's point. But we could imagine I could draw this slightly differently. That I could draw this to look like this. So my AD will stand for my aggregate demand. SRAS will stand for my short-run aggregate supply. That I could make it look like this. That's L long-run aggregate supply. Or that I could make it look like this. Now, how long is the long run? How short is the short run in terms of time? It's as quickly as it takes for prices to adjust. And prices, again, don't move that quickly. This situation here is going to be called a recessionary gap. Because the short run is at a level of output that's less than the long run potential. But in the long run, or in this situation here on the right, this is going to be called an inflationary gap. And it's called an inflationary gap because temporarily the output is actually above the long run capacity of the economy. What would you do here? Here is where you would use expansionary policy. Because the idea is that that's going to shift this aggregate demand curve out to the long run. And here you're going to use the contractionary fiscal policy. To reduce the economy down to here. And this is exactly what you see here. Here you see an economy that would have been initially, let's call this 1, in its a recessionary gap, and then would have used expansionary fiscal policy to move the economy out to this long run point. It's called point 2. Okay. So we can also look at this from the perspective of taxes. And again, as we just kind of have mentioned here, when the government taxes, that means that we can't spend, that you and I as individuals can't spend that money. So again, the idea, not completely illegitimate, is that if we reduce taxes, then we have more money that we theoretically could spend. The unfortunate part, and the part where this all gets messy, is that we don't do it. Truman, go. Go potty. Go potty, okay? Sorry. The data. And this is what the data tells us. The data tells us that altering tax policy is actually less effective than changing government spending. So if you are in this class and you are more of a Republican-leaning kind of individual who believes in tax cuts to stimulate the economy, I'm not trying to dismiss your idea. I'm just telling you that the data, at least that economists have collected thus far, suggests that it's not as useful as just actually changing directly government spending. Okay, Truman. And the reason for that is that it's not that the thought process is wrong. It's just that people, it's a psychological thing where people like to pay off their own debts with savings from their taxes rather than spending it, which is kind of what we want people to do. Yes, Truman. Yep, Daddy's still working, okay?
Well, what that place?
Yeah, it's for class, okay?
Okay.
Okay. How big is the multiplier? Well, the multiplier is about, most economists believe it's about 1.5 to 2 times, meaning that, for instance, the rail project, what's the budget? Like $10 billion, isn't it? I think. I could be wrong. So that would be $20 billion, right, of stimulation in the economy. Yeah, and that's what we see right here. This is kind of review what I've just explained here. An expansionary fiscal policy shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, and it closes the recessionary gap. And that's exactly what you see right here. An expansionary fiscal policy, you would use it because at point E, I'm in a recessionary gap. And then I use expansionary fiscal policy and that shifts AD to the right and allows me to go from point E to point F. Now we could do the opposite. We can do the opposite with the inflationary gap. We would use then the contractionary fiscal policy. That means I would either reduce my spending or raise my taxes. And as I've explained before, you see that right here. So it's called an inflationary gap because if we didn't do anything at all, you would end up going up this aggregate demand curve and end up at higher prices. So that's why it's called an inflationary gap. But what we're doing here is at E, we're in an inflationary gap. And so what we do is we use contractionary fiscal policy to shift aggregate demand curve to the left, and that allows me to go from E to A. Okay. Okay, so let me stop this first part of the video right here, and then I'll pick it up with part 2.